For 36 years, Clara Thompson's life was a museum of grief. The empty nursery frozen in 1987, the silence in a house that should have been filled with laughter. Every night for 13,140 nights, she asked herself the same questions. Who took her baby, and why? She always imagined a stranger, a phantom who crept in and vanished without a trace, leaving a wound that could never heal. She was wrong. The evil that shattered her world wasn't a phantom. It had a name. It had a face. And, for decades, it was hiding in the last place anyone ever thought to look. One accidental discovery, a forgotten piece of cloth pulled from the heart of a dying tree, would finally connect the quiet neighbor to the empty crib. It would prove that sometimes the most monstrous secrets are the ones that have been in plain sight all along. October 12, 1987 was a day of ordinary magic in Cedar Falls, Washington. The kind of magic that goes unnoticed until it's gone forever. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and damp earth, and the afternoon sun cast long, golden fingers across the manicured lawns of the Sycamore Lane cul-de-sac. Inside the small blue house at the end of the street, Clara Thompson was performing the quiet rituals of a new mother. At 26, her world, once filled with the ambitions and anxieties of youth, had simplified into a universe of pure, overwhelming love. That universe was 8 months old and sleeping soundly in the room down the hall. She folded laundry on the living room floor, the fabric still warm from the dryer, tiny socks no bigger than her thumb, a yellow onesie with a cartoon duck. Each item was a testament to the new life that had completely remade her own. Her hands moved with a gentle, practiced rhythm, but her thoughts were elsewhere. They were always elsewhere now, tethered to the soft, rhythmic breathing from the nursery. The room was painted a soft, buttery yellow. A mobile of smiling wooden stars dangled silently over the white crib. This was Clara's sanctuary. She walked in, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet, and stood over her daughter, Amelia. Even the name felt like a perfect round stone in her mouth. Amelia Rose Thompson. She was a beautiful baby, with a dusting of blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was sleeping on her back, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring cadence. Her tiny fist was curled near her cheek, her rosebud mouth slightly open. The scent of baby powder and sweet milk hung in the air, a perfume more precious to Clara than any French concoction. Clara reached into the crib and gently adjusted the blanket around her daughter. It was a soft pink, knitted from fine merino wool, its edges stitched with a silky white ribbon. In the bottom corner, 3 letters were embroidered in careful, looping cursive, A.T. It had been a gift from Clara's own mother, finished just a week before Amelia was born. Every baby needs something made with love to keep the bad dreams away, she had said, her hands placing the folded blanket into Clara's. Now, as Clara tucked it around Amelia, she felt a profound sense of peace. It was more than a blanket. It was a shield, a soft pink armor of love and family history. She watched for a moment longer, memorizing the curve of her daughter's cheek, the flutter of her eyelashes against her skin. It was a moment of perfect contentment, the kind of fleeting, beautiful moment that makes a life. Later, that afternoon, her husband, Mark, came home from his accounting job. He dropped his briefcase by the door, loosened his tie, and the first thing he did was walk to the nursery. He peeked in, saw Amelia sleeping, and exchanged a silent, smiling glance with Clara. Their small family, whole and safe under one roof. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversation a comfortable murmur about groceries and Mark's demanding boss, all of it underpinned by the quiet, happy reality of the baby sleeping. Just down the hall, as evening fell, the house settled into its nightly rhythm, the ritual of bath time, with its happy splashes and the fresh scent of baby shampoo. The last bottle, with Amelia's sleepy eyes growing heavy as she drank. Mark read a short story from a picture book, his deep voice a soothing rumble, in the quiet room, while Clara rocked Amelia gently in the old wooden rocking chair they'd bought at a flea market. These were the moments, the small, ordinary, perfect moments. They were unaware, as all people are, that they were living through the final hours of the life they knew. At a little past 9, Clara carried a drowsy Amelia back to her crib. She laid her down gently, the baby barely stirring. She pulled the pink blanket up to Amelia's chin, leaned over, and breathed in her daughter's scent one last time. "Good night, my sweet girl," she whispered, her lips brushing against Amelia's forehead. She checked the window out of habit. It was an old single-pane sash. Window. She slid it down, but the latch was finicky. It didn't quite click into place. A minor, forgettable detail in a house full of them. She didn't think twice about it. She left the nursery door slightly ajar, just enough to hear if Amelia cried out, and went to her own room, feeling the pleasant exhaustion of a day spent loving someone. She and Mark read for a while before turning off the lights, the house finally falling into a deep, peaceful silence. It was the silence that woke her. At 2:14 a.m., Clara's eyes opened in the darkness. There was no sound, no cry, no whimper, just a profound and unnatural stillness that felt wrong. Every nerve ending in her body went on high alert. Mark was sleeping soundly beside her, but she felt a cold dread begin to pool in her stomach. She told herself the thought a desperate prayer, but the excuse felt thin, hollow. She slipped out of bed, her feet finding the cold wood of the hallway floor. The house was dark, the only light a faint silver glow from the moon filtering through the living room window. Every step toward the nursery was a negotiation with her own rising panic. The hallway seemed to stretch, the few feet becoming a mile. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. She reached the nursery doorway, her hand trembling as she pushed it open wider. The first thing she noticed was the cold, a draft. Her eyes shot to the window. It was open, a black gaping rectangle against the pale wall, the curtains stirring in the faint night breeze. The sight didn't compute. It was an error in the code of her reality. Then her gaze fell upon the crib, and the world stopped. It was empty. A breath hitched in her throat, a choked, soundless gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, not to stifle a scream, but because she had no air to make one. Her vision swam, the yellow walls seeming to warp and recede. The smiling wooden stars of the mobile swayed gently in the draft, their cheerful shapes a grotesque mockery. "No," she breathed, the word a tiny broken thing. She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, and patted the mattress. She searched for warmth, for the small, solid weight of her child, her fingers clawing at the empty sheets. Cold. It was all cold. The blanket was gone. The baby was gone. Gone. The word echoed in the sudden roaring void in her mind. For a few terrible seconds, the only sound in the universe was the frantic beating of her own heart. Then the dam of her shock finally broke, and a sound tore from her throat, a raw, primal scream of pure agony and terror. It was a sound that didn't belong in a quiet house on a peaceful street. It was the sound of a world being fractured, irrevocably and forever. The scream that tore through the silence of Sycamore Lane on October 12, 1987, was only the beginning of the noise. Within minutes, the quiet cul-de-sac was flooded with the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers, their strobes slashing across bedroom walls and illuminating the faces of concerned neighbors peering through their windows. The Thompsons' small blue house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. Clara moved through the ensuing chaos in a state of numb disbelief. She remembered the coarse wool of a blanket being draped over her shoulders, the steam from a cup of tea she couldn't bring herself to touch, the dispassionate voices of uniformed men asking questions she couldn't comprehend. Where were you? Did you hear anything? Is there anyone who might want to harm you? The questions were a meaningless buzz, distant and irrelevant. The only reality was the cold, hollow space in her chest where her heart used to be. The investigation was headed by a Detective Miller, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a drooping mustache. In the first few days, he was a figure of authority and reassurance. He spoke of statewide alerts, of bloodhounds, of an FBI task force. He promised Clara and Mark, his hand on their shoulders, "We're going to find her. We'll bring your daughter home." Clara clung to those words, repeating them to herself like a mantra. They were the only thing keeping the world from dissolving into pure terror. The police searched the house, the yards, the nearby woods of Pioneer Park. Flashlight beams cut through the undergrowth, and volunteers shouted Amelia's name until their voices were hoarse. They found nothing. No footprints, no discarded clothing, no ransom note. It was as if the baby had simply evaporated from her crib. Days bled into weeks. The police theory shifted. A kidnapping for ransom where the call never came, a drifter passing through town, a woman who couldn't have a child of her own and had acted on a desperate, tragic impulse. They questioned Clara and Mark relentlessly, their sympathy slowly curdling into professional suspicion. They were separated and interrogated for hours, their every word scrutinized, their grief put on trial. The process left them feeling violated and raw, their private tragedy now a public file, their love for their child a potential motive. During their canvass of the neighborhood, Detective Miller and his partner knocked on the door of the house next door. It was occupied by a Leonard Finch, a reclusive man in his 50s who lived alone and restored antique furniture in his garage. He was quiet, almost painfully awkward, and seemed agitated by the intrusion. He claimed to have heard and seen nothing. "I go to bed early," he'd mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. "I take a pill to sleep. The world could end, and I wouldn't know it." Miller noted him down as uncooperative but harmless and moved on. A week later, another neighbor, a woman from across the street, called the station. She told Miller she remembered something. On the night Amelia disappeared, she'd been woken by her dog barking and had glanced out her window. She saw a figure standing near the edge of the Thompsons' property line, partially obscured by a large maple tree. She couldn't be sure, but it looked like Leonard Finch. "It was strange," she said. "He was just standing there, staring at the house." The lead was logged but never seriously pursued. Finch was the odd, reclusive neighbor. In the eyes of an overtasked police force looking for a more likely suspect, he was just a local eccentric, a dead end. The months that followed were a slow, grinding torture. The national news crews packed up their vans. The USMO volunteers stopped searching. The phone calls from Detective Miller became less frequent. His voice strained with a fatigue that sounded too much like defeat. The case went from active to open, and then open to cold. The noise that had once filled their lives faded back into an unbearable silence. It was in this silence that Clara and Mark's marriage disintegrated. Grief was not a bridge that joined them, but a chasm that separated them. They were two people stranded on opposite shores of the same tragedy. Mark couldn't bear to be in the house. Every room, every object was a monument to their loss. He started working late, drinking more, finding any reason to be away from the suffocating stillness of their home. Clara, meanwhile, couldn't bear to leave it. Leaving felt like giving up. It felt like abandoning Amelia all over again. They fought, their arguments born of a pain so immense it had to be turned outward. Blame, unspoken but always present, hung in the air between them. 2 years after Amelia disappeared, Mark moved out. He left on a Sunday morning, his packed suitcase a final, quiet surrender. He still loved Clara, but he could no longer live inside her museum of grief. Clara was alone, and in that solitude she transformed. The initial frantic hope for Amelia's return slowly petrified into a grim, methodical resolve for answers. She became the sole archivist of her daughter's case. She fought for months to get copies of the police reports, and when she finally did, she read them until the pages were soft and worn. She bought a corkboard and hung it in the spare room, tacking up a map of the neighborhood, photos of Amelia, and timelines of the investigation. She created her own case file, a thick binder filled with notes, theories, and highlighted inconsistencies. Leonard Finch's name was in the file, with a small, handwritten question mark next to it. It was a ghost in the machine, a detail that didn't fit, a loose thread she could never quite grasp. Years slid by, silent and indistinguishable. The world outside moved on, the town grew, new families moved in, children were born. But inside the small blue house, time was frozen. Clara's hair began to show threads of gray. Wrinkles formed around her eyes, etched there not by age, but by sorrow. She became a familiar but distant figure in the neighborhood, the woman with the tragic past. She marked the milestones of a life that never was. The first day of kindergarten, she imagined. The first lost tooth, the awkward school pictures she would never have. The most difficult day was always October 12th. On the day Amelia would have turned 16, Clara baked a small chocolate cake, the kind a teenager might like. She placed a single candle in the center and lit it in the silent, empty house. She carried the cake into Amelia's room, which was not a nursery anymore, but a memorial, and sat on the floor. She spoke to the daughter she only knew as an infant. She told her about the music she might have liked, the friends she might have had, the person she might have become. It was a monologue of love and loss, delivered to the ghost of a life, a ritual of remembrance that was both her torment and her only comfort. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a witness, the last person on earth whose sole purpose was to remember that Amelia Rose Thompson had existed and to demand an answer, even if only from the silent, unforgiving walls around her. For 36 years, the world spun on. Technology reshaped society. Generations were born and grew old, and the town of Cedar Falls changed in 1,000 subtle ways. But in the dark, damp hollow of a dying oak tree in Pioneer Park, a secret lay dormant, wrapped in decaying wool, waiting. Its discovery would not come from a planned police search or a deathbed confession. It would come, as the most profound revelations often do, entirely by accident on a bright, sunny afternoon in the summer of 2023. It came thanks to 3 teenagers armed with a smartphone and a sense of suburban boredom. Their names were Leo, Maya, and Ben, and they were geocaching. Leo, the self-appointed leader of the group, held his phone up, squinting at the screen. "The GPS says it has to be right here," he announced, pointing toward the massive, gnarled oak that stood like a weary sentinel at the edge of the woods. The tree was ancient, its bark thick and furrowed like an old man's skin, some of its larger limbs long since sawn off, leaving dark, gaping wounds. "Dude, nobody's put a geocache in that thing for years," Ben said, kicking at a root. "It's probably full of spiders." "The app says it's a 5-star difficulty. It's supposed to be hard," Maya countered, her curiosity piqued. "Come on, let's just look." They circled the colossal trunk, running their hands over the rough bark. It was Leo who found it, a deep, shadowy hollow about 4 feet off the ground, partially hidden by a curtain of ivy. "In here," he said, his voice echoing slightly from within the cavity. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed its beam into the darkness. It was deep, filled with a mulch of rotted leaves and dirt, and something else. "See? There's something back there," he said, a note of triumph in his voice. He reached his arm deep into the hollow, his fingers brushing against something soft and damp. It wasn't the hard plastic of a waterproof container he was expecting. Wrinkling his nose at the musty smell, he gripped the object and pulled. It came out with a soft, tearing sound, a heavy, mud-caked bundle of fabric. He dropped it on the grass with a wet thud. It was disgusting, covered in dirt and what looked like patches of black mold. "Gross," Ben said, taking a step back. "That's your treasure? A dirty rag?" But Maya knelt closer. She saw a flash of color beneath the grime. Using a stick, she carefully peeled back a corner of the filthy bundle. The fabric, though rotted and stained, was unmistakably pink. As she pushed more of the dirt away, something else became visible. 3 small looping letters stitched in a faded white thread. The teenagers fell silent. They were young, born in a different century, but even they knew the stories. Every town has its ghost, its local legend. In Cedar Falls, that legend was the baby who vanished from her crib on Sycamore Lane a lifetime ago. The Thompson baby. Back in the small blue house, Clara Thompson was watering her geraniums. Her life was a quiet loop of routines designed to keep the past at a manageable distance. She tended her garden, she read, she watched the news. She existed. The silence of the house was a familiar companion. So when the telephone rang, its shrill electronic sound was a violent intrusion. She answered, her voice a little rough from disuse. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was young, male, and cautious. "Ma'am, my name is Detective Sandoval with the Cedar Falls Police. I'm calling for Mrs. Clara Thompson." Clara's heart gave a single painful jolt. Police, after all this time. This is she. "Ma'am," the detective continued slowly, choosing his words with care, "something has been found in Pioneer Park, an item. We think it might be connected to your daughter's case. Hope is a dangerous thing for a heart that has learned to live without it." For Clara, it felt like a poison, a searing heat spreading through her veins. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles turning white. "What item?" she managed to ask, her voice a bare whisper. "We'd prefer if you could come down to the station to identify it, ma'am. Would you be able to do that?" The drive to the station was a blur. The police building was new, a modern structure of glass and steel that had replaced the old brick building she remembered from 1987. Detective Sandoval met her at the door. He was young enough to be her grandson, with kind, dark eyes that held a mixture of pity and professional resolve. He led her to a small, sterile room. On a metal table in the center of the room lay a large, clear evidence bag. Inside it was the object. Time collapsed. Clara stopped breathing. It was a filthy, decayed piece of cloth stained with 36 years of earth and rain. But she saw it. The soft pink of the wool, the silky white ribbon on the edge. And in the corner, faded but undeniable, the two letters her mother had so lovingly stitched. A sound escaped her lips, a small, wounded sigh. She reached out a trembling hand and pressed her fingers against the cold plastic of the bag, as if she could feel the texture of the blanket through it, as if she could feel the warmth of the child it once held. "It's hers," she said, the words thick with a grief so old it felt new again. "It's Amelia's." Later, after she had regained some composure, Detective Sandoval sat with her, a cup of water in her shaking hands. He explained what would happen next. In 1987, this would have been the end of the line, he said, his voice gentle. "But we have tools now they couldn't have dreamed of. We're sending the blanket to the state crime lab in Olympia. They'll be able to test for DNA, for fibers, for anything that might have survived." For the first time in over 3 decades, the case of Amelia Thompson was not about looking back at a cold trail. It was about moving forward. The blanket, once a shield to keep a child warm, had become a time capsule. And, as it was, carefully packaged, documented, and sent on its way, it carried with it the first glimmer of a terrible, necessary light. The discovery of that blanket, in such an unlikely place, left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item can rewrite history. If you, like me, are fascinated by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. The discovery of the blanket sent a jolt through the quiet corridors of the Cedar Falls Police Department, but it was in the sterile, climate-controlled environment of the Washington State Crime Laboratory that the real work began. For weeks, the fragile piece of fabric was subjected to a battery of tests that were the stuff of science fiction in 1987. Technicians in white lab coats painstakingly isolated fibers, scraped away microscopic particles, and used sophisticated chemical processes to search for the ghosts of human touch preserved for decades by the cool, dark earth. For Clara, this period was a unique form of torment. The long, empty desert of uncertainty she had inhabited for 36 years suddenly had a horizon. But the waiting, which had once been a dull, chronic ache, was now sharp and acute. Hope, she learned, was a far more painful emotion than despair. It demanded attention. It made the phone's silence feel heavier, the passing of each day a more personal failure. The case was officially reopened, and handed over to the county's new cold case unit, a small, determined team tasked with breathing life into forgotten tragedies. The head of that unit was Detective Eva Rostova. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, direct demeanor that left no room for false promises. Her first meeting with Clara did not take place at the station. Rostova came to the little blue house on Sycamore Lane. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted to understand the space where the tragedy began, to walk the same floors Clara had walked on that horrifying night. As Clara led her inside, Rostova took in the home that was also a memorial. She saw the framed photo of a smiling baby on the mantelpiece, the profound quiet of the house, the invisible weight of the years. Clara was cautious, guarded. She had seen detectives come and go. She had heard every empty platitude, every well-meaning but ultimately hollow assurance. She watched Rostova with a weary skepticism, her heart shielded against another round of inevitable disappointment. "Mrs. Thompson," Rostova began, her voice even as she sat opposite Clara at the small kitchen table. "I'm not going to tell you we'll solve this case. I'm going to tell you that we will work it with everything we have. The science will take us where it takes us. My only promise is that we will follow it to the end." There was no pity in her voice, only resolve. For the first time in a very long time, Clara felt a flicker of something other than resignation. She nodded, giving the detective her permission to try. 3 weeks later, the call came. It was Rostova. "The initial lab results are in," she said, her tone professional, unreadable. "I think it's best if we discuss them in person. Would it be all right if I came over?" Clara knew what that meant. The news was significant. An hour later, they were sitting at the kitchen table again. Rostova placed a thin file on the table, but didn't open it. She looked directly at Clara. "First," she said, "the lab confirmed the primary DNA profile on the blanket belongs to your daughter. They were able to match it to the DNA from her baby hair you provided for the national database years ago. There is no doubt, Clara. That was Amelia's blanket." Clara closed her eyes, a wave of emotion washing over her. It was one thing to know it in her heart. It was another to have it confirmed by science. It was real. It was all real. "There's more," Rostova continued gently, waiting for Clara to meet her gaze again. "The lab was able to isolate a second partial DNA profile from the blanket. It was degraded but viable. It doesn't belong to you, your ex-husband, or anyone in your family." Clara leaned forward, her body tense. "Whose is it?" "It belongs to an unidentified male." The words hung in the air, heavy and dissonant. Clara frowned, a deep line forming between her brows. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to clear a confusing sound. "A man?" she repeated. No, that's not right. It had to be a woman. Someone who wanted a baby. That's what I always believed." For 36 years, the phantom who haunted her had a female face. It was a story she had told herself, a narrative that gave a strange, maternal logic to an illogical crime. "The science is unequivocal, Clara," Rostova said, her voice firm but not unkind. "The last person to have significant contact with that blanket, other than Amelia, was a man." The foundation of Clara's grief, the very shape of her monster, cracked. She felt a profound sense of disorientation, as if the world she had so carefully constructed from her pain had just been proven a fiction. She had spent a lifetime mourning a crime of desperate love, only to be told it was something else entirely. Something perhaps much darker. Rostova let the weight of that revelation settle before she continued. "There's one more thing, and this might be what gives us a direction. The forensic team found microscopic particles embedded deep in the wool fibers. They're not from dirt or pollen. They've been identified as a specific type of industrial furniture varnish. It was a high-end product primarily used by professional restorers of antique wood." She slid a single sheet of paper from the file. It was a chemical analysis report, a series of complex names and numbers. To Clara, it was meaningless. "The manufacturer stopped making this exact formula in 1990, Rostova explained. "It was rare even back then. This isn't something a hobbyist would have in their garage. This is a clue, a real one. It means we're no longer looking for a faceless woman driven by grief. We're looking for a specific man who, in 1987, worked with antique furniture and lived close enough to this house to be here on the night of October 12th. Clara stared at the report, her mind reeling. A man, a furniture restorer. The abstract horror of her daughter's disappearance was suddenly tethered to a tangible, specific detail. After a lifetime of wandering in an endless desert of questions, Detective Eva Rostova had just handed her a compass. The ghost that haunted her had a new face, and, for the first time, a potential occupation. The hunt had begun. The forensic report from the State Crime Lab transformed the investigation. The case of Amelia Thompson was no longer a ghost story. It was a homicide investigation with two tangible clues: the DNA of an unknown male and the chemical signature of a rare furniture varnish. For Detective Eva Rostova, this was the start of the real hunt. The first phase was a slow, painstaking excavation of the past. Rostova and her team descended into the dusty archives of the county courthouse, a place where time was measured in decaying paper and the faint smell of aging glue. They spent days scrolling through microfiche, their eyes straining at the glowing green text of 1980s business directories and tax records. They cross-referenced every licensed furniture maker, cabinet builder, and antique restorer against the 1987 Cedar Falls phone book and property tax rolls, building a list of anyone who had the skills and lived within a 5-mile radius of Sycamore Lane. The list was long and filled with dead ends, men who had died, moved away, or worked with different materials. The work was a grind, a methodical process of elimination far from the dramatic breakthroughs of television dramas. Their first promising lead emerged after 2 weeks. The name was Frank Miller, a man who had lived just 2 streets over from the Thompsons in 1987. Records showed he ran a small, unlicensed business out of his garage, crafting custom cabinets. When 2 detectives from Rostova's team went to interview him, now a cantankerous man in his late 70s, living in a retirement community, he became immediately defensive. He denied ever using high-end industrial varnishes, claiming he only ever used common polyurethane. When asked for a voluntary DNA sample to be excluded from the investigation, he refused outright, telling the detectives to get a warrant. The behavior was a massive red flag. For a week, Frank Miller became the focus of the investigation. They dug into his past, finding a sealed juvenile record for petty theft. They put him under surveillance. The team felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. Rostova's gut, however, told her something was off. Miller's defensiveness felt more like the paranoia of a grumpy old man caught off guard than the fear of a killer. Still, they pursued the lead with vigor, eventually getting the warrant for his DNA. The result came back in 48 hours. Not a match. Frank Miller was a dead end, a red herring that cost them valuable time and left the team feeling deflated. The setback sent Rostova back to the one person who knew 1987 Sycamore Lane better than any public record, Clara. She returned to the small blue house, not with news, but with a request. She unrolled a copy of the original 1987 neighborhood plat map on Clara's kitchen table. "The records can only tell us so much," Rostova said, her finger tracing the outlines of the houses. "They don't tell us about hobbies, about who was friends with whom, about the things people saw but never thought to mention. I need you to be my memory, Clara. I need you to walk me through this street, house by house." For Clara, it was an agonizing exercise. These were not just names on a map. They were the faces of a life that had been stolen from her. But her grief had also sharpened her memory into a fine, precise instrument. She sat for hours with Rostova, old photo albums spread open, pointing out the Carsons who threw loud barbecues, the Gables who had the yappy dog, the young couple in number 12 who were always fighting. Then her finger stopped on the house directly next door, the one she had shared a property line with. "This was Leonard Finch's house," she said quietly. Rostova looked at the name on the map. "What do you remember about him?" "Not much," Clara admitted. "He was very quiet, lived alone, older. I don't think I ever had a full conversation with him, just hello, nice weather, that sort of thing. She paused, a distant memory surfacing. There was always a smell, though, coming from his garage. Turpentine, I think, and varnish. A strong chemical smell. Mark used to complain about it sometimes when the wind blew the wrong way. The word varnish hung in the air. Rostova's focus sharpened. The original police report said he was interviewed, the detective recalled. Claimed he slept through the whole night. He was reclusive, Clara added. A little strange, I suppose. He made everyone feel a bit uncomfortable, but no one ever thought he was dangerous. The moment Rostova returned to the station, she put Leonard Finch under a microscope. She pulled his file from the archives. There it was, a detail so small it had been ignored for decades. A copy of a 1982 business license for Finch Fine Restorations. Address, 14 Sycamore Lane. He wasn't just a hobbyist, he was a professional. The quiet man who was dismissed in the first 24 hours of the investigation was now their prime suspect. Rostova immediately dispatched a detective to re-interview the neighbor who had reported seeing a figure by the Thompsons' house that night. The neighbor, now an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, was hesitant. "It was so long ago," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "Leonard is dead. What good can it do now?" "It can bring the truth to light," the detective said gently. "That's always worth something." Mrs. Gable looked out her window toward the house where Finch used to live. With a deep sigh, as if unburdening herself of a weight she had carried for years, she recounted the memory. This time there was no hesitation. It was Leonard Finch she saw that night. She was sure of it. He was standing by the trees, motionless, watching the Thompsons' house long after its lights had gone out. The memory had haunted her, but she had been too afraid to press it with the police to accuse her neighbor. Her testimony now placed Leonard Finch at the scene of the crime. The problem, however, was immense. Leonard Finch had died of a heart attack in 2005. He had no living relatives. He had been cremated, his ashes scattered. There was no body to exhume, no easy way to get his DNA to compare with the profile from the blanket. The investigation had slammed into a seemingly impenetrable brick wall. The truth was within reach, but the man who held it was gone. The team was gathered in a conference room, staring at a whiteboard covered in Finch's name, his photo, and a dozen dead ends. The mood was bleak. "So we're done?" a junior detective asked, frustrated. "We know it was him, but we can't prove it?" Rostova stared at the board, refusing to accept defeat. "There has to be something," she muttered, "something he left behind." It was then that the youngest member of the team, a detective who had been tasked with the unglamorous job of tracking down Finch's will and property records, looked up from his laptop. "I don't know if this means anything," he said, "but Finch didn't have much. No family. According to his will, he left his house to a charity, and his tools were sold at an estate sale. But there's one other thing, a deed of gift. In 2004, a year before he died, he donated 3 pieces of his work, a restored 19th century writing desk, a grandfather clock, and a rocking chair to the Cedar Falls Historical Society. A dead silence fell over the room. Every eye turned to Rostova. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the aha moment. A craftsman like Finch, a man obsessed with the perfection of his work, would have spent hundreds of hours touching, sanding, and polishing those pieces. He would have left his own story, his own DNA, sealed in the very varnish he used. "Get a warrant," Rostova commanded, her voice ringing with renewed energy. "We're going to test a dead man's furniture." The Cedar Falls Historical Society, usually a quiet repository of the town's benign past, became the final, sterile theater for its most stubborn mystery. Under the soft glow of museum lights, a forensic team from the state lab moved with quiet purpose. They were not dusting for fingerprints, but hunting for ghosts. With long, sterile cotton swabs, they meticulously wiped the surfaces of the furniture Leonard Finch had left behind, the smooth, curved back of the rocking chair, the ornate drawer pulls of the writing desk, the hidden interior of the grandfather clock. They were searching for the microscopic traces of himself that the meticulous craftsman had unknowingly left behind. Each swab was sealed, labeled, and sent back to the lab. Then the wait began again. This time it was different. It was the final question. There would be no more leads, no more theories if this failed. For Clara, it was a week of suspended animation, of living on a knife's edge, between a lifetime of uncertainty and a truth she wasn't sure she could bear. The call came to Detective Rostova on a Friday afternoon. The voice of the lab supervisor was calm, professional, and absolute. The partial DNA profile recovered from the antique writing desk, preserved for decades under layers of wax and polish, was a perfect match to the partial DNA profile found on the baby blanket. The probability of the samples coming from two different, unrelated individuals was less than 1 in 10 billion. It was scientific certainty. The ghost had a name, confirmed in the language of genetics. The man who took Amelia Thompson was her next-door neighbor, Leonard Finch. With this final, crucial piece, the entire ugly puzzle fell into place. Rostova and her team, piecing together Finch's life from the few records he left behind, could now see the man no one in 1987 had bothered to look for. He was not a monster of calculated evil, but something perhaps more disturbing, a man of pathological order. His life was a fortress of routine and silence. He woke at the same time, ate the same meals, and worked with the solitary, obsessive focus of a monk. His passion was taking broken, chaotic things, splintered chairs, scarred tables, and restoring them to a state of flawless, silent perfection. His world was one he could control. Into this world came the sound of a baby crying. To Leonard Finch, it was not the sound of life. It was an invasion. It was a chaotic, unpredictable noise that pierced the walls of his sanctuary and shattered his control. The narrator can now walk us through that night from his perspective. For weeks, the sound had grated on him, a slowly building pressure inside his skull. On the night of October 12th, something inside him snapped. It wasn't premeditated. It was an impulse, a desperate, rage-fueled need to simply make the noise stop. He slipped out of his house and across the lawn, his shadow swallowed by the darkness. He found the window, unlocked, a detail he hadn't expected, a simple, fateful opportunity. Inside, he moved not toward the baby, but toward the source of the chaos. In his mind, he was restoring order. He took the baby, wrapping her in her own blanket to muffle the cries. But she didn't stop. In his panic, he pressed down, harder and harder, his only thought to bring back the silence. And then, it was quiet, terribly quiet. The chaos was gone, but in its place was a horror he was not prepared for. He was not a killer, but he had killed. Panicked, he fled, taking the baby and the blanket with him. He buried the tiny body in the soft earth of his own neglected garden, and, in a final frantic act, shoved the blanket deep into the hollow of the old oak tree in the park, a place on his daily walking route, a secret he would pass by for the rest of his life. Detective Rostova drove to Sycamore Lane one last time. She knew this was the most difficult part of her job. Delivering the truth was sometimes more brutal than the crime itself. She found Clara in the garden, tending her flowers. They sat at the same kitchen table where the journey had restarted weeks before. Rostova didn't begin with the DNA, she began with the story. She laid out the life of Leonard Finch, the quiet obsession with order, the growing irritation, the final impulsive act. She told it not as a theory, but as a fact, a sequence of events now proven beyond any doubt. Clara listened, her face a pale, still mask. With every word, the ordinary, awkward neighbor she remembered was being remade into a monster. She remembered seeing him in his yard, his brief, evasive nods. She remembered the acrid smell of varnish from his garage, a smell that now seemed sinister, suffocating. She remembered once finding his mail, mistakenly delivered to her box, and walking it over to his porch. He had opened the door a crack, taken the letters without a word, and closed it. An insignificant moment between neighbors, now replayed in her mind as a chilling encounter between a killer and his victim's mother. "We found his DNA on the desk he donated to the Historical Society," Rostova concluded softly, her voice bringing Clara back to the present. "It's a perfect match to the DNA on Amelia's blanket, Clara. It was him. There is no question." The air left Clara's lungs in a silent rush. It was over. The question that had defined her entire adult life now had an answer. It was not a shadowy phantom or a mysterious stranger. It was the quiet man next door. The horror of it was not in its complexity, but in its banal, horrifying simplicity. Her daughter was killed not for ransom, not for ritual, but because she was a baby who cried. There was no sense of victory, no feeling of justice served. There was only the sickening, crushing weight of the truth, a truth that had been just a few feet away, on the other side of a hedge, for 18 years. With this irrefutable proof, the brutal truth finally came to light, proving that perseverance can overcome decades of silence. If stories of justice like this inspire you, leave a like to support our research. There was no trial, no conviction, no sentencing for the man who killed Amelia Thompson. Justice for a crime this old is rarely so clean. Instead, it arrived in the form of a press conference held in a sterile government briefing room. Detective Eva Rostova stood at a podium, flanked by the chief of police, and formally announced that, after 36 years, the Amelia Thompson case was officially closed. She named Leonard Finch as the sole perpetrator, his guilt established by irrefutable DNA evidence. Clara watched it on the local news, sitting alone in her quiet living room. Seeing Finch's photograph on the screen, a black-and-white image of a nondescript, awkward man, sent a chill through her. It was the face of the ghost that had haunted her life. Hearing the words "case closed" offered no elation, no sense of victory. It was simply the sound of a heavy iron door finally swinging shut after a lifetime of being open. But Rostova's work was not quite done. In a final act of diligence, her team managed to track down several boxes of Finch's personal effects that had been sold at his estate sale in 2005. Among them were a handful of thin, leather-bound journals. Most entries were mundane, detailing his work or complaining about the weather. But in an entry dated November 1987, just a few weeks after Amelia's disappearance, one cryptic line stood out. Rostova knew he wasn't talking about gardening. Armed with a warrant, a forensic team returned to Sycamore Lane one last time. They went to the backyard of the house where Leonard Finch once lived, now owned by a new family, and began to excavate the earth at the base of an old maple tree. A few feet down, they found what remained of a tiny, fragile skeleton wrapped in the tatters of a small pajama. Clara got the call that afternoon. They had found her. They were bringing her home. The funeral was held on a gray, overcast morning. It was a small, private affair. Clara was there. Mark, her ex-husband, stood beside her. The years and the grief had made them strangers, but for this one moment they were simply Amelia's parents, united in the final heartbreaking duty of parenthood. They buried a small white casket in a quiet corner of the cemetery, under a headstone that was finally engraved with a date of death. It read, "A lifetime in a single dash." In the weeks that followed, something inside Clara's house began to shift. The air, for so long thick with unanswered questions, started to feel lighter. One afternoon, she walked down the hall and stood at the doorway of Amelia's room. For 36 years, it had been a shrine, a place frozen in time, a testament to her refusal to forget. Now she saw it for what it was, the bedroom of a child who could finally rest. Slowly, methodically, she began to pack things away. She folded the tiny onesies and sleepers and placed them in a box. The stuffed animals, the picture books, the wooden mobile with its smiling stars. Each object was a memory, and she treated each one with a gentle reverence. It was not an act of erasure. It was an act of love. She was not dismantling a memorial to a missing child. She was putting away the cherished belongings of a daughter whose story was finally complete. She kept only two things: a single smiling photograph which she placed on her nightstand, and the pink blanket, now cleaned and preserved, which she folded and laid in her cedar chest. The case had a legacy beyond Clara's own quiet closure. Spurred by the decades-long failure to identify a suspect who lived next door, the state of Washington passed a new piece of legislation colloquially known as Amelia's Law, which reformed protocols for evidence collection in missing children cases, ensuring a more thorough and immediate canvassing of those in close proximity to the victim. Clara's life found a new, quiet purpose. She started a small local support group for parents of missing children. In a church basement on Tuesday nights, she sat with others who were lost in the same desert she had once inhabited, and she offered them the one thing she never had: the company of someone who understood. She could not offer them answers, but she could offer them her presence, a quiet testament to the fact that it was possible to survive the unthinkable. Her house was no longer a museum of grief. It was just a house. Sometimes she would sit on her porch in the evening, watching the sunset on Sycamore Lane, and she would feel the vast, aching space of Amelia's absence. But it was no longer a raw, open wound. It was a scar, a part of her forever, a testament not to the monster who lived next door, but to the boundless, enduring love of a mother who never, ever gave up. The story of Amelia Thompson teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe and let us know in the comments from which city you watch this incredible conclusion.